Over the last 2 to 3 weeks, I have consistently been receiving requests for two videos. One of them is a video exploring the future of the left in a post-Bernie world. That one is one that I'm working on right now, and it will be available by the end of the week. The other video request that I've had is to look at Biden's VP options and talk about them. It's pretty unusual that I get requests for political videos. I get a lot of comments usually saying that people want more history videos and that I make too many political videos. So it's kind of a novel experience to have people basically begging for this kind of video. But anyway, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to make a video about Biden's vice presidential options. I have had to change this first slide a number of times, and I'm frankly sick of recording it. I initially messed up the counting on this. I thought there were only 11 candidates I was talking about. Then I discovered that I had 12 people listed. Then I discovered that I left off an entire candidate who is one of the more important ones. So we're going to look at 13 potential picks for Joe Biden, looking at their pros and cons. But our criteria for analyzing them will be a little different than what I normally do. Rather than talking about who would be best, what I'm going to talk about is based on my understanding of what the establishment is looking for, who is the most likely to appear on the ticket. And while we're discussing that, we'll then go into who would actually be the most effective at helping Joe Biden to win the election. Before we get into all of that stuff, though, we'll look at two things. First, what is Biden's path to the presidency? What conditions have to be met for him to have a chance? Second, we will then look at what the establishment is looking for. We'll also talk about some of the conflicting priorities of members of the establishment as they try to hash out who should be Biden's VP/successor. So hopefully this will be a lengthy and semi-enjoyable time waster as you while away the hours of quarantine. Remember, in the near future, I will have another video on the future of the left, so if you enjoy political content, stay tuned for that. Let's consider Biden's path to the presidency in 2020. It is not an easy one, but any candidate with a major party nomination has a chance. A puncher's chance, I guess you could say. Trump in 2020 had perhaps a 30% chance if we go by Nate Silver's numbers. Most other analysts would actually have put it lower, and he still managed to do it. So Biden could potentially pull it off, but in order to win the presidency, what he'd need to do is put himself in a position where he could take advantage of the situation as it develops and be in the strongest possible position that he can be at this juncture. Now, what he will need to do is pick someone as VP and also work hard through outreach and platform planks in order to win back ground with young voters and with the left in general. Those two things overlap, but of course it is not a complete overlap. Some leftists are older than, say, 35 or 50, and some young voters not necessarily leftist, but they still don't seem to like Biden very much. A recent poll showed that with voters under 35, Biden and Trump are actually tied at about around 44%, and that is a devastating number because even though the youth vote is not the biggest demographic vote in American elections, Democrats rely very heavily on winning that vote in order to make up ground for the demographics they lose, i.e. older voters. And if they're not winning that by a healthy margin, then things are bleak indeed. So Biden has a lot of ground to make up, and I'm sure that he will make up some ground. Certain people will return to the flock in due time. However, a whole lot of people aren't going to be coming back this time, especially not after the Tara Reade revelation and just his general disdain for working people and the left. So it will be a tough task, but he can make some of that back up. Now, he will never be in a very strong position, but he can be in a puncher's position. So that's what I'm talking about here. He'll have to work very hard for some very, very modest gains. And then after that, a lot of what would happen to put him in a position to become president is completely beyond his control. There will be economic turmoil after the quarantine lifts. We're already experiencing it right now, especially for people in the service industry who are not working, or other industries too, but especially the service industry. And the question then becomes, how well does the economy rebound? Who gets blamed for it? And how desperate are people for a change in leadership? So does Trump seem to do competently or incompetently? Unfortunately for Biden, a whole lot of this will rest with Democrats who actually hold political office right now, so the various governors and people like Nancy Pelosi. So far, it does not appear that Nancy Pelosi will give Biden much to work with because she has not handled this crisis well at all. That being said, it's always possible that the Democrats get their act together right on time, Trump shits the bed on something, and then Biden's in a position to win narrowly. So that's how I see it, at least. Another option is that Trump prematurely lifts the quarantine in order to try to revitalize the economy, and it's premature and this leads to unnecessary deaths, or both. We have an economic collapse, not really collapse, but just an economic bad recession combined with some deaths. Anyway, you get the idea. A lot of this is beyond Biden's control and even somewhat beyond Trump's control, but that is what Biden would need in order to have a real chance at winning. As I mentioned, we will be ranking all 11 candidates from least likely to most likely to appear on the ticket, and in order to do that, we first need to establish what it is that Biden and his various advisors will be looking for in a Democratic running mate. So when I refer to Biden's considerations, I mean the considerations both of Joe Biden and of all of the various people around him, from Joe Biden to the various consultants to Barack Obama to Tom Perez. So there are a lot of people implied when I say Biden. I'm not talking about him personally necessarily, although there is one person for whom I do think that Biden will have an especial liking. First of all, we have to consider that Biden made a pledge very publicly to pick a female running mate. That is something that he can't really back out of at this juncture. He may have managed to win over some votes with that pledge. I'm not sure how many voters he won with it, but if he won any and then backed out on it, that could be devastating. I assume he was trying to win over Warren voters when he was then in the duel with Bernie Sanders, and that was his consideration then. But with the Tara Reade allegations coming out, I think at this point he absolutely can't back away from that pledge, and I would be shocked if anyone advised him otherwise. Whoever he picks will have to be presidential timber in her own right. Sometimes you can pick a running mate who provides balance to a ticket in a geographical sense or some other somewhat soft sense. And normally, yes, you do want a VP who could potentially be president, but in this case, it can't be someone who is future presidential material. It'd have to be someone who could govern right now. So if Biden were to be forced to step down in February of 2021, this person would have to be able to step in right then and there and govern the country. Biden and a lot of his voters would be aware of that. So in many cases, what they'd be voting for is Biden's running mate, but really more just against Trump, with the understanding that whoever they elect will be somewhat able to run the country. I mean, that's really what the pitch will be. This person will also have to have loyalty to Biden's to-be-determined vision for the country. This will mean that ideally, from the perspective of Biden, this person will not have all that many hard and fast ideological commitments, because Biden right now is searching for a winning message. Unlike most candidates after they win in general, he actually will have to pivot left rather than right because of where his base is and because that is where the biggest number of votes to be gained is for him. So he will need to figure out a way to do that. And I think that one of the things that will appeal to Biden's team more so than to him personally is someone who doesn't really have a very clear track record. This person also has to have some kind of appeal in theory or in fact to voters on the left and/or independents, preferably both. And when we're considering that, we will try to think of it from the perspective of the establishment consulting class rather than from, say, empirical reality. And there's a huge difference there, of course. Another thing that will be very important for the Biden team is age and some degree of ideological difference, but not too much. This comes back to this idea that the person should not have too many hard and fast positions. One that Biden has come out against very strongly is that he would veto Medicare for all. So if a candidate has stated support for Medicare for all, that would present an obvious contradiction, and putting that person on the ticket would very much diminish her credibility and also call into question his sincerity on that pledge. So that would be an issue. Another factor is geography, a very traditional political science-y consideration. The region that Biden, just like any Democrat, needs to win is the Midwest. I'm sure most consultants would probably still say that, but also there are some who have a deep-seated contempt for the working class and who think that the new path for Democrats is through the Sun Belt. So most likely whoever gets the nomination will either be someone with appeal in the Sun Belt or in the Rust Belt. So with all of that in mind, let us now move to candidate 11. The 11th most likely Democratic vice presidential nominee is Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts and failed presidential candidate. The only reason that she's being considered is because she is a sop to the left in general and to the Warren Democrats in particular. Now, Warren has started the Warren Democrats mostly just to keep the left divided and warring against itself, and also for her own political ambitions. I won't go too much into the dealings of the snake. I will save a lot of that for my discussion of the future of the left in my next video. The problem with Warren is that she did not heed the wisdom of Rowdy Roddy Piper. He once famously said in the movie They Live that the middle of the road is the worst place to drive. And she tried to be both establishment and on the left. And it didn't work. No one bought the act. People on the left, except for the Warren Democrats, think of her as untrustworthy and also as frivolous and egotistical. Her temper tantrum over snake emojis on Twitter, of course, was not impressive and demonstrated zero leadership or basic maturity. And clearly her lack of commitment to a lot of issues, especially Medicare for all, is somewhat suspect in the eyes of the left. As for the establishment, they also don't trust her because she does seem serious about limiting the size of banks and imposing regulations on Wall Street. So she doesn't really fit what they would be looking for. Now let's say if Biden were 20 years younger and extraordinarily unlikely to die in office. You could put Warren on the ticket as a sop to the left and potentially try to use her message of Wall Street is bad to appeal to a lot of voters in the middle who may feel that Trump's bailout is too generous to Wall Street. Had she not bombed in the primary, that would make a lot more sense, and I could see that happening. But as it is, the establishment knows that whoever they put on the ticket is likely to get the keys to the kingdom, and there's no way in hell they would want Elizabeth Warren getting those keys. There were donors early in the primary process who said that Warren was the candidate they feared and hated the most. I don't think that anything has happened to change their conception of her. That being said, Warren also has another issue militating against her. She, in theory, supports Medicare for all. Her convoluted plan for passing it, of course, is a joke, and it has to count as self-support, but nonetheless it is support. And while it's not a deal breaker because of how softly she stated it and how clearly willing she is to sacrifice that in order to get other objectives, it's still a problem from an establishment standpoint. Warren clearly has a different view on healthcare than the guy on the top of the ticket, and if Biden were to die or become incapacitated in office and Warren became president, who's to say that she might not go left? Now, personally, I don't think she would, but you never know, and people in the establishment would probably not be willing to take that risk. I don't even think her chances of getting a cabinet position are very high. If she does get a cabinet position, the best she can hope for is probably CFPB, the organization that she proposed 10 years ago. I've heard her name floated for Treasury Secretary. I don't see that happening. I'd be shocked if it did. If she does get a position in the cabinet, it will either be very minor, or it will be one where she gets in and then she gets dismissed rather quickly in order to get her out of government because, again, the establishment does hate her despite her efforts to win them over. So I have to say that her chances of being on the ticket are extraordinarily low, despite the speculation. The 10th most likely vice presidential pick is Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta. She is 50 years old, she's an African American female, and she has been a Biden cheerleader since at least June 2019. It seems that she and Joe know each other and get along pretty well. I assume that her inclusion on this list is mostly a kind of courtesy, and that the only reason Biden is even hinting that he might choose her is simply to show his gratitude to her for the help that she provided his campaign. As someone from the Sun Belt, Bottoms also fits his geographic needs, and as an African American woman who holds public office and is considerably younger, she checks a lot of the kind of superficial boxes that one would look for. That being said, I don't think she's terribly likely, and I feel that her inclusion was merely a courtesy and formality. First of all, she's only been Atlanta mayor for 2 or 3 years. She hasn't really done anything, and her public service record is rather limited. It's also worth observing that Atlanta is not nearly so massive a city as, say, LA or New York or Chicago or something like that, so the kind of authority that she had would not have prepared her in any way to become vice president. She also was involved in 2 relatively minor to moderate scandals before she even took office. One of them was that there were robocalls placed in her name in the Atlanta suburbs, which supposedly suggested that she hated white people. Most likely these were Republican ploys, but even so, they could resurface and be used as evidence that she is racist. The other one is that apparently, for reasons unknown, she decided to pay her campaign workers in cash off the books, and did so to the sum of something like $150,000 or $200,000. Now, these aren't the biggest scandals in the world, and obviously neither prevented her from winning, but still, that's not a good start, especially when her career has been so short. As mayor of Atlanta, she has clashed with Trump over ICE. She said that Atlanta should be open to all, and that racism is bad, and that's pretty much the extent of her track record. I would not be too eager to put a bet on her appearing on the ticket. So if you are placing bets on this, she would be a very bad bet. The only way I could see her getting on the ticket is if Biden's campaign were to really crater, and then he was just forced to turn to somebody who was loyal, and she's the only person willing to accept. In that case, I could see her on the ticket, but most likely that won't happen. So she's only marginally more likely than Warren simply because she doesn't trigger as many donors, but she still isn't really qualified to be here, and as I said, she's here as a courtesy. Coming in at number 9 is another Georgia peach, Stacey Abrams. Abrams, of course, famously ran for governor in 2018 and came very, very close to winning the race. Of course, the narrative has been that she was cheated. I don't know the exact truth of that. I assume that there may have been a little bit of voter fraud, but I don't know for sure. I haven't looked into that in any detail. But Abrams has become something of a celebrity in the aftermath of her gubernatorial run, and her name has been floated a lot. If Twitter were picking Biden's running mate, Abrams would have this thing on lockdown. However, I don't think she's actually all that likely, despite her fandom on Twitter and among the professional managerial class. She has become a public advocate for voting rights due to what happened to her in Georgia, and that's all fine and well, but that is more of the kind of platform you would need to run for a statewide office or perhaps for a congressional seat in the House. If you're running for something like Senate or, in this case, Vice President, you really need a broader platform, and I have seen very few indications that Stacey Abrams has that. She does have a decent amount of experience, enough to possibly be on the ticket, even though it's on the weaker side, but all of her experience has been in the Georgia General Assembly, so there would be a lot of aspects of national politics that she may not have any familiarity with, certainly no experience with, so that would be a problem, and it would be hard to imagine someone coming out of a state legislature and then governing the whole country. And again, that's something that would very likely happen in a Biden administration. Another factor for Abrams is that she's ambitious and wants to be president in her own right. She has responded to some people who suggested that she get on Biden's ticket by saying that maybe she should be the one on the ticket at the top. So Stacey Abrams, for these reasons, I think is not all that likely to make it. I think she is another example of a courtesy inclusion because she's a black woman from the Sun Belt, and she is very popular among the Democratic base in terms of the people who show up on Twitter and are members of the PMC. So she had to be included, but I don't think she's really in the running. Now, she's more likely, in my opinion, to appear than Mayor Bottoms or Senator Warren, but that's not saying much. The eighth most likely person to appear on the ticket with Joe Biden is Wisconsin Senator Tammy Baldwin. Baldwin, while she's not likely to appear on the ticket, would very much be the best option for Biden electorally and in terms of running a government which could actually get stuff done. Baldwin is a Wisconsin senator. She is the only openly lesbian member of that body. It's possible that being an open lesbian would have some electoral liabilities with it. However, that being said, the other VP on the ticket, that being Mike Pence, is a little too Christian for almost everyone's liking, so maybe it's not as bad as some people might think. Baldwin, unlike Biden, is in favor of Medicare for all. She's unapologetically pro-labor, and she's also antitrust. This means that she would appeal to the left in a way that none of the other people we're going to talk about could hope to. She could reunify the party, at least to a greater extent than any other person. Say if Biden were somehow to pick Bernie or Warren, the problem would be that those candidates have had a lot of exposure and there is clearly bad blood there. Baldwin is lower profile as a progressive, so she would have a better chance of bringing back those voters without rehashing old arguments. So if Biden were very much looking to win at all costs, and if winning were the major consideration, I think that Baldwin would clearly be the top choice. When it comes to putting someone on the ticket who can actually govern the country, I think Tammy Baldwin, once again, is clearly the top dog. She has the most complete package in terms of her ability to govern, in terms of issues she's dealt with and worked on and spoken about. Most of the other candidates we'll look at have surprisingly limited and thin records. Baldwin is someone who is more or less complete. Now, her resume would be a lot more complete if she had run for president and been forced to lay out positions on a larger number of issues, but as it stands, she is one of the more fleshed out of the candidates in this field. Here are the things that will keep her off the ticket other than the obvious policy clashes with Biden. Baldwin self-identifies as a La Follette-style progressive. While La Follette was a Republican, this was back in the days when someone could be a Republican progressive in the mold of Teddy Roosevelt. La Follette was from Wisconsin, and that's why she chooses to use him as her example of how she models herself politically. Baldwin, because of her advocacy for labor and antitrust legislation, would have a great appeal in the Midwest. That being said, clearly this is not in line with Joe Biden. And if you are a member of the donor class, you might be okay with putting Baldwin on the ticket to get Biden in office. However, when you know that Biden's unlikely to actually finish a first term, much less do 2 terms, you then look at the prospect of having an old school progressive of the Teddy Roosevelt variety in office. And from the perspective of the donors, that is somewhat of a non-starter. However, I think that Baldwin's Midwestern appeal and her ability to actually govern will be considerations. I don't think that she will end up coming all that close to being chosen, but she will still beat out some of the people I've talked about before. And in terms of being a viable progressive choice, I think that she would be the best progressive to balance out the ticket if they decide to go that route. I don't think they will, but if they did, Baldwin would be the person to go to. Unlike, say, Warren or Bernie, if Biden were to somehow get out of his pledge about picking a woman, they already have detractors, and there's a lot of bad blood in the water because of the primary process and everything else. But with Baldwin being a relatively fresh face, this would avoid some of that clash. And this would definitely be the smart move, but it's unlikely to be the move that the establishment makes. The seventh most likely person to be chosen by Joe Biden as his running mate is perennial opportunist New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. Now you might be thinking, isn't Gillibrand still persona non grata among many Democrats for the shanking of Al Franken for personal gain? Yeah. Doesn't she lack charisma? Yeah. Didn't she really shit the bed in the 2020 primary despite a lot of media coverage and a lot of money and having a lot of advantages? Yeah, all those things are true. Here's what you're overlooking. Kirsten Gillibrand is really good at backroom politics, and she has a lot of friends in strategic positions. She also has a lot of friends at editorial boards who can try to eloquently make her case. What Gillibrand will do, in my opinion, and I imagine she's working on this right now, is to go to Biden and the people near him and make the following pitch. Due to the Tara Reade accusations, Biden's standing with women is low. And in order to win most of them back, he will need to be exonerated by a woman with standing among the Me Too crowd. Alyssa Milano is already doing her best, but she's just a celebrity. And she's certainly not Kirsten Gillibrand. So, as one of the official leaders of Me Too, and someone who has been very, very strong on the issue, Gillibrand is the only one who can officially exonerate Joe, and the only way that she can do so effectively, not that she would be unwilling to otherwise, is if she's on the ticket with him, because that would show her support, and therefore the support of all Me Too supporters for the Biden ticket. That is the pitch she'll make. Now, it's a dumb pitch, and it's unlikely that someone with as little pull as Gillibrand would actually make a difference. That being said, you have to think about this from the mindset of people who believe that identity politics is effective. They could look at the primary and see that every candidate, including Kirsten Gillibrand, who tried identity first, failed miserably, but that's not the lesson they're going to be taking away from the primary. So Kirsten's case will sound compelling to them. I don't think it will necessarily put her in as the nominee, but it will certainly mean that she is actually being considered. Gillibrand has another thing going for her that I think is underestimated as a tool. Now, while she has more stated positions than most of the people we're talking about since she did run for president, she still is rather undefined overall. And she also has a history of political evolution to the left over time, as she went from a conservative district to a statewide candidate in New York, which is a liberal state. And because Biden will need to move left because he can't really move right at this point, he's as far right as he can go as a Democrat, she could present both a mild contrast and serve as a pivot point for Biden to move left on a couple of issues in order to try to appeal to a broader base. So, Gillibrand actually does make sense, at least on paper. In practice, I think she would be a pretty bad pick, but the establishment, as shown by Hillary picking Tim Kaine, likes to make bad picks sometimes. The sixth most likely person to be on the ticket with Joe Biden is Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar. She's now well known after having run for president for over a year and appeared in a number of nationally televised debates. while she didn't do all that well, she didn't really attract a ton of hatred, and as someone who's high profile, she has to be considered in the running. She also has a winning record in elections. She has won every race that she's been in, according to her. Well, except for the last primary, but I guess to be fair, when you have 26 or 27 people running, yeah, most people in that are going to lose whatever their previous track record might have been. So, I guess one could overlook that fairly easily. But Klobuchar also was fairly simpatico with Biden on the issues. She probably has a few too many lines in the sand in the past, but because she's always been somewhat in the center, her lines are not all that well defined. She also was generally seen as a serious candidate. I don't think there are too many people who would say that Klobuchar was a complete and total joke. Her weaknesses are the slip up on the AMLO question. Biden usually tries to run himself on being really strong on foreign policy, and because Klobuchar didn't know AMLO's name, she revealed that foreign policy is not one of her strong suits. So that is something of a chink in her armor in terms of her trying to appear as this generally competent, boring, but competent person. And of course, her treatment of staffers is legendarily bad. And the reason why I think that would be something of a problem is that, in general, as I was talking about with Gillibrand, you want someone on the ticket whose presence implies that they wouldn't be there with Biden if they felt that the accusations from Tara Reade were legit. In the case of Klobuchar, it's clear from the way that she treats her staffers that she wouldn't give a shit if those accusations were true or not. And that, she's not going to worry about it because Biden's not going to harass her. She would murder him. So that kind of doesn't help with that issue. Also, while Klobuchar does have some pull in Minnesota, I'm not sure how much pull she has outside of Minnesota. Some people I know claim that she has some pull in Wisconsin as well. So if she could potentially help in both those states, that would, of course, be very beneficial to any Democratic nominee. When it comes to Klobuchar governing in her own right, aside from the foreign policy issues and some staff abuse considerations, in general, she comes across as competent, but also very boring and uninspiring. If people think about their choice as being between Klobuchar and Trump, it's hard to get enthused about Amy. She just doesn't really offer anything, and again, she would be a very dull president. She has some clear limitations as a national candidate. She doesn't have a lot of charisma. She would have a lot of trouble rallying the country behind her in a time of crisis because of the limited charisma. And in terms of winning the election in 2020, she doesn't do anything at all to shore up the left base. Now, before this, she was considered someone who had some left appeal, even if it was not all that strong. But over the course of the primary, she very consistently bashed the left and the priorities of the left. She did so in a civil fashion, but still in a very clear fashion. And I don't think that this would be anything that would bring Bernie and Warren supporters back on board. Misgendering people is bad, but misnumbering them is even worse. Earlier I said that Amy Klobuchar is number 6. She's actually number 7. Because number 6 is Val Demmings. Val Demmings is a House member from the state of Florida. She's an African-American female, 63 years old, and she got her start in politics as the first female police chief of Orlando, Florida. I think that she will be relatively seriously considered. She matches the sort of general idea that Democratic consultants are looking for right now. She doesn't have a high profile. She's from a state that's important. She is a member of the demographic that the Democratic Party considers its backbone, older black women. And she also is liked within the party and doesn't have a whole lot of hard stances to her name. So she, in theory and on paper, is the perfect generic Democrat. Despite the experience of 2004, there are still a number of people within the party who think that the generic Democrat strategy is fucking genius. here are the problems. If this were a normal year and the candidate didn't have clear cognitive decline, I would put her higher on this list. The thing is, at age 63 with only 2 House terms, she has a pretty limited political ceiling. So let's say if you thought Biden could last 2 or 3 years before turning it over, then maybe you could see her growing into the role. As it is, her age means that she has some limits to her potential, and also she just doesn't have enough experience right now to govern if, say, Biden were to kick the bucket in March or whatever. So she really isn't a viable option from a governing standpoint. That being said, the other considerations do seem to militate in her favor. From the perspective of someone who understands to some extent how the black community votes, the fact that she's a cop will not help her with black voters. But from the perspective of the establishment, the fact that she is a loyal rank-and-file Democrat in a lot of senses, that she's someone Pelosi trusts, will mean that they won't see that. So I think that she will get fairly serious consideration, and that if she were put on the ballot, she would not be a very big help. That being said, she's probably not the weakest choice, but she's definitely not a strong choice either. So again, I think that she's basically in the middle in terms of the likelihood that she gets picked. Not only am I not that great at counting, but also I forgot an entire candidate. What you're about to listen to is the second to last recorded slide of the entire presentation, and the last recorded slide, for those of you who might be interested in such things, will actually be the very first slide, where I have to correct the number from 11 to 12 to 13 in terms of the number of candidates we're covering. Anyhow, the real number 6 is Gretchen Whitmer. Whitmer is the current governor of Michigan. She is 48 years old, and right now her stock is riding relatively high in terms of her reputation. She was elected in order to clean up the mess left by Rick Snyder, who was one of, if not the most destructive and catastrophic governors in all of American history. Snyder famously is the person who created and then failed to solve the Flint water crisis, among other things. That was not his only misdeed, believe it or not. But let's not get into Michigan politics. Whitmer right now is also well known for 2 things in regard to Donald Trump. One, she has a high-profile feud with him over the handling of COVID-19. She wants to take her state in a different direction than what he wants to do nationally, and the 2 of them have exchanged words. This means that she's a hero on MSNBC and a villain on Fox. Just the kind of person to put on a ticket to be an attack dog, since there's already bad blood. She also delivered the response to the State of the Union, which means that she has friends in high places among the apparatchiks of the party. Or I guess the word is technically pronounced apparatchiks, but who gives a shit? Anyhow, she has been a national figure, at least a little bit, since 2013 when she reported on her experience as a sexual assault victim, and since then she's gotten involved in politics more wholeheartedly. Of course, she sort of timed that well because the Me Too movement happened not long after that, and she was able to ride that wave. Then after 2016, a lot of women decided to get involved in politics. Whitmer is also a beneficiary of that. And now Joe Biden's looking for a woman running mate. So once again, the gods and the odds shine upon Gretchen Whitmer. So all of that may seem like a pretty strong case in her favor, but here is something to consider, and something that I'm sure will weigh heavily among some of the consultants who will be considering her. Being a woman is her only claim to diversity. Most of the other people on this list can claim, say, bisexuality or being Latina or black. Whitmer can't claim any of those things, and identitarianism matters a great deal to establishment pundits. Here's another thing to consider. Aside from trying to clean up some of Snyder's mess and feuding with Trump, Whitmer has not been all that successful as governor. She has an infrastructure plan which is much needed, but which is funded in a fundamentally regressive and unpopular manner. She is implementing a 45-cent per gallon gas tax in order to pay for that, and it has been very unpopular even among registered Democrats. Everyone in the state agrees that it sucks. It basically tripled the gas tax. And it's regressive because it impacts people who make less money more. It is a sales tax. So that's something to consider. While Whitmer does have some regional name recognition in the Midwest, she is not necessarily known as a friend of the working class because of this gas tax. And that is a liability. So the thing that should be her strength probably won't help her very much. That's something to consider. Now, how heavily the establishment pundits will weigh that is anyone's guess. But if I were to really put money on it, I would say that they're looking to go in a different direction and that they want to save Whitmer for the future. They might nominate her at some point in the future, but I don't think it will be in 2020. Right now, I also feel that she probably thinks that she has an obligation to stay in Michigan until she can undo more of the damage of Rick Snyder. So I don't think she seriously wants to be on the ticket. That being said, she is still one of the stronger people in consideration, and I would not be surprised if she were more or less forced by the powers that be to join the ticket. The fifth most likely person to appear on the Democratic ballot as Joe Biden's VP is Senator Kamala Harris from California. It's safe to say that right now she is easily the noisiest paper tiger in all of American politics, bar none. No one else has received more accolades for doing less than Kamala Harris. Not even the late John McCain was more overrated than Kamala Harris. The narrative that is being promoted about Kamala and her 2020 primary run is that she proved to the world that she is smart, strong, and tough. The reality is that she's none of those things, and she revealed her immense shortcomings to the entire world. Now, of course, you can't go on TV and say that Kamala is not smart, strong, and tough because it would come across as racist and sexist. And perhaps it is the case that there are establishment people who know this, but just won't say it out loud. I suspect, however, that there are a good number of consultants who literally do believe this and will try to urge Biden to choose Kamala, because that would make him appear magnanimous by turning to his great rival from the early days of the campaign, the person who did him damage early on when it seemed like no one else could lay a glove on him. However, there's another thing to consider. Biden probably doesn't like her very much personally, and while that is not a decisive factor, if all other things are equal, I think that this would be something that would weigh against Harris. The other thing that might weigh against putting her on the ticket is that a Biden-led ticket right now is likely to lose, and most really ambitious people like Kamala probably don't want to be associated with the losing ticket, especially if you're losing to Trump, the boogeyman of the Democratic Party. So, there are reasons why she might not be as likely as a lot of the media coverage makes it out that she is. Here are the things in her favor. She's ideologically compatible. She has the identity appeal from the establishment perspective. There's a reasonably good age differential. Kamala's, mid-50s, I think. And she has adequate experience. I wouldn't say it's good experience, but she has adequate experience. Here are some other things to consider, though. So, just like a lot of people who ran, Kamala ultimately had no success because her appeal is limited. She has no economic message. She wouldn't get you any votes in either the Sun Belt or in the Rust Belt, especially in the latter. I can't imagine factory workers in, say, Michigan or Ohio getting excited for a ticket with Kamala Harris, who will only talk about class if she's forced to, and even then she'll assume that you're referring back to her 10th grade geometry class. She's also not accepted as black by the black community, so her identity value is extraordinarily limited. They see her as part Indian and also as a cop. So to them, she is something of a fake black person. So she would not help with the urban vote in, say, Cleveland or Milwaukee or even Atlanta. How many establishment consultants will admit that is another question, and that's why I think you can never rule her out, because there are still a lot of people who believe that Kamala is a beast. But we've seen her in action, and we know that she damn sure isn't. The whole reason the California primary was moved up was in the hope that Kamala would catch on with voters and she could put things away early. She failed miserably in the primary, and she will still have advocates, and that is why you can't quite count her out, and why she's the first person we've talked about who I think has a serious chance. So, yeah, everybody before this point has been a Hail Mary. Kamala's the first real candidate we've talked about so far. Now let's move on to someone who is more likely than Senator Harris. Democratic consultants and Joe Biden will have a heated debate over Kamala Harris because they will see her as someone with a ton of upside, but also some very obvious failings. And I think that that will encourage them to go a different route and open the door for women who are more likely to appear on the ticket because their downsides are less pronounced and because they have fewer enemies. First up in that category is Michelle Lujan Grisham, the New Mexico governor. Before she was governor, she served 3 terms in the House. She was also the New Mexico Secretary of Health, and she was once a county commissioner. She is Latina, and she is age 60. This means that while she doesn't create a big contrast with Biden in terms of age, she's clearly younger and probably does not have dementia. She also provides some diversity by being Latina, and she has enough experience to be a plausible candidate for president and someone who one could imagine governing the country. So on paper, looks pretty good. Here are some issues that might work against her, however. She married a much older man who died in 2004 in his 80s. 16 years hence, she is only 60. I'm not saying she's a gold digger, but she's not marrying any broke dentist. Here's another thing. Her tenure in the House was very uneventful, which from the perspective of the establishment is probably a good thing. You can see in Lujan Grisham whatever you want because she apparently has very few hard and fast stances. But she did have a little scandal on ethics because of a trip to Azerbaijan, where apparently she accepted gifts that she was not supposed to accept. I believe there are a few other people implicated, fairly minor, but still, given the lack of other things she did in the House, that is not something that you want on your record. You didn't really make up for that in other ways. As governor, she has not really been all that interesting. She signed an executive order in order to curb emissions. It was some really technocratically worded thing where it is trying to reduce 2005 levels of emissions by 2030 by about 30% or something like that. So not a very progressive or interesting piece of legislation, or in this case executive action, but still it's something. I guess it demonstrates some leadership and some commitment to the climate. Pretty limited, but then again, New Mexico is not all that powerful of a state, and to the best of my knowledge, not a huge polluter to begin with. But here's something that I think should give people pause if they're thinking about her leadership. And again, it's hard to say exactly what the establishment counts as leadership, but here's something that should raise flags, and I'm sure with some consultants would. So, Roe versus Wade from the early 70s overrides state legislation before it, which limits abortion. So there is a bill in New Mexico, which was passed in 1969, which outlawed abortion. And as basically a meaningless gesture in order to show her support for women, Governor Lujan Grisham decided to urge Democrats to repeal this law. But she couldn't get the democratically controlled state Senate to do that. They voted against her proposal 24-18, even after it cleared the state house. And all she could do was express her rage in an editorial. So that could work against her. Her record, again, is limited. However, she's another person who, in theory, checks most of the boxes. In practice, maybe not as much. But again, I think that she is probably a little more plausible than Kamala Harris because she doesn't seem to have any real enemies within the party unless you count the state senators who clearly don't take her very seriously. The third most likely lady to appear on the 2020 Democratic ticket is Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth. I don't mean to be unkind to her, but to put it bluntly, Tammy Duckworth is someone who is completely and totally devoid of anything resembling talent. Whether we're talking about the ability to govern or the ability to win political office, Tammy Duckworth has yet to prove anything. She owes the entirety of her position in life, at least after her military career, to the connections that she made and the fact that consultants love her story. Here's her story, and I think that if you think about it from an establishment identitarian perspective, you'll see why consultants are very eager to try to sell Duckworth, because she seems on paper like a really cool candidate. So, Duckworth obviously is a woman. She's a disabled Asian American veteran. She was in the United States Army. She was in a helicopter crash. She lost both of her legs and she lost the use of one of her arms. So she fought for the country and came very, very close to making the ultimate sacrifice. So she can literally claim without any exaggeration that she gave her all to this country. And no one can really contest that. She also has an interesting background, family-wise. So her mother is Thai, and she was born in Thailand. Her father, however, is American, and his family dates back to the time of the American Revolution, and he has ancestors who fought in George Washington's Continental Army. And despite some of the speculation that people made about Ted Cruz in 2016, the fact is that as long as one of your parents is an American citizen, native born or not, is irrelevant, you then are an American citizen regardless of where you're born. So Duckworth is not prevented in any way from being president by the fact that she was born in Thailand. It makes no difference. There are people who would question that, of course, and that would be a liability in an election, because I'm sure the Republicans would spread the idea that she was some sort of Manchurian candidate and that, she wasn't a legitimate American, whatever. The fact is that she actually is. Okay. So because of all those reasons, and because she can use the veteran thing, the Asian thing, the female thing, the disabled thing, she has every possible identity marker going for her except that she's a heterosexual. So the establishment loves her, and they keep pushing her over and over and over. Here's how we know that she doesn't have it. In 2006, right after she had recovered from her injuries, she was discharged. The Democrats put her up for what was supposed to be their wave election. It was a wave, and Rahm Emanuel tried to take full credit for it. The narrative is that Rahm Emanuel picked all of these super viable centrist candidates, and all of them won. In reality, there are some major exceptions. Some people he refused to back, like Joe Sestak in Pennsylvania, won anyway. And then you have people that Rahm Emanuel poured his heart and soul into. Tammy Duckworth is really Rahm Emanuel's protege, and she lost even with a monetary edge. Rahm was going and hooking her up with all of the top donors. She raised almost $5 million. Her opponent only raised somewhere in the $3 million range, and she still lost. And this is in Illinois, by the way. So, after that, she went home, and then Obama was elected in 2008. Because Rahm Emanuel was Obama's chief of staff, he decided to make sure that Duckworth was given a position to help pad her resume, because he just knew that she was destined for greater things. So Duckworth served as assistant secretary of Obama's VA. There have been questions about her conduct in that office. It was actually pretty boring. Assistant administrators of the VA really just do reports, and most of those reports are well after the fact, pretty uneventful. But she didn't really do anything well or poorly. It was a pretty boring tenure altogether. So then she dropped out of that and decided to go home to Illinois to run once again for Congress. In 2010, there was a Republican wave election where a number of people got elected who were completely unviable outside of a Republican wave. One of those people was Joe Walsh. You may remember Joe Walsh. He actually tried to challenge Trump for the Republican nomination this year, and he got about 1% of the vote. Anyway, this Joe Walsh is not the same as the singer because when it comes to politics, life has not been good to him. Joe Walsh is most likely in the closet, and back in 2010 and 2012, he was a very angry man who said a lot of racist stuff and really went too far even for the majority of Republicans who self-identified as Tea Partiers. He famously went off on people at town halls, and he was just really bad at his job. He also had some alimony issues. He seemed to be going through a midlife crisis. He had frosted tips and shit in his 40s. I mean, it was bad. Joe Walsh was pretty damn bad. So this is an ideal situation for Tammy Duckworth because now a presidential election, so Democratic turnout will be higher. Obama's on the ticket again, and a lot of people who were elected who were basically unviable, like Joe Walsh, are having to defend their seats. So during this election, Joe Walsh, who couldn't keep his mouth shut, said in an interview that Tammy Duckworth was just playing up her injuries and that she's just trying to milk sympathy and that she should shut up about her service. He then tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. He disrespected an American veteran who gave a lot for the country, and not surprisingly, people thought that it was offensive. He lost. She didn't win, but he lost. And I think this is part of why the establishment loves Tammy Duckworth, is because she's a target-rich environment, and people just go after her and say dumb shit, and then she's able to play the victim. In 2016, she decided to move on from the House to the Senate. There was another Republican from the class of 2010 in the office, Mark Kirk. Mark Kirk was a much better politician than Joe Walsh, but he was a Republican running in Illinois, which is a deep blue state, in a presidential year. So he was basically fucked from the outset, barring catastrophic failures on the part of the Democrats. Needless to say, Tammy Duckworth had all the support in the world going into that race because she is a darling of the party. Mark Kirk again repeated the Joe Walsh mistake for reasons that are unclear. Rather than going after her injuries, however, he instead said that when they were in a debate, she was talking about her American Revolution heritage. He said, "I didn't know that your ancestors went from Thailand all the way to serve in George Washington's army." So that came across as racist. Most likely he was trying to make a joke and it just didn't land. But anyway, people thought it was racist. And he was probably going to lose anyway, but this basically sealed his fate. So she won that race, which again was more her opponent losing than her winning. Nonetheless, from an establishment perspective, Tammy Duckworth is a winner. And she also has a lot of boxes that she checks. If we look at her platform, she clearly is not really able to govern because she hasn't really done anything with the time she's had in office. Now, technically, she's qualified to be president. She had a military career for a number of years, and then she has been in Congress and in the Senate, so both the House and the Senate. Here, the only thing she's ever talked about veterans issues because, you know, she's a veteran. She's also made some vague foreign policy statements about what's good or bad or responsible, never anything too concrete. She said that Trump is reckless in general, so she has at least qualified her critiques with some specificity, but never really anything too concrete. So not the worst member of the hashtag resistance, but certainly not the best. And she's also famous for being the first female senator to have a baby while in the Senate, and then a special rule was passed to allow her to breastfeed on the floor of the Senate. Kind of a neat footnote and something that would help balance out Biden's ticket, but really she's not able to govern. From an establishment perspective, however, you can't criticize her. She's a golden goose, so there's a good chance that she gets the nod. That being said, she clearly has some failings, and I'm sure that some consultants who have worked with her in the past are aware of those, and they might raise those considerations. That being said, most people within the party apparatus are quite happy with Duckworth, and it would not be surprising at all if she gets the nod. I did not mean to spend this long talking about Tammy Duckworth. She doesn't deserve nearly 10 minutes of my time, but she got it anyway. God damn it. Based on my understanding of what the establishment is looking for, the number 2 person in terms of likelihood to appear on the Democratic ticket is Arizona Senator Kirsten Sinema. Sinema has some major upsides from their perspective, but also some pretty big downsides, although I think those are things that most of the establishment people making the pick will be more than willing to overlook. Let's take a look at Sinema's qualifications, such as they are. First of all, Sinema presents a very strong contrast with Joe Biden on a superficial boomer aesthetic level. She is 43 years old, so she's on the other end of the age spectrum when it comes to people running for president. Only a handful of people who would consider themselves on the presidential level are younger than Sinema. She is bisexual, which adds to her diversity without really being something that people get offended by. I don't think too many people are worried about the bisexual takeover. Even back during the height of homophobia, I don't think too many people gave a shit about attractive women being bisexual. She's also fairly attractive, especially compared to most other politicians. There aren't very many politicians who, well, most of them, of course, are a lot older, which doesn't help, but very few of them, I think, would be considered as attractive as Kirsten Sinema. And she's also very healthy and athletic. She's someone who climbs mountains, does triathlons, things like that. So she presents a stark contrast with Biden and also with Trump. Now, Pence seems like a fairly healthy guy, but he's not young and vibrant. So, Sinema seems fairly lively and would bring a certain amount of life, at least on the surface, to the Biden campaign. Sinema also has a decent amount of experience, more experience than Obama had when he became president, and about the right amount, I think, for someone running for office. She had 3 terms in the Arizona House. She then had a brief Senate term in Arizona before going to the House of Representatives for 3 terms, and currently she is a senator in her first term. One interesting thing about Sinema, which I think would be a massive liability with the left, and the thing most likely to shoot her down, since I think that most establishment figures will realize the need to win over the left, is that Sinema is one of the least popular figures among the left. Her evolution since the Bush years makes her an out-and-out traitor. Here's what she started out as. She was a Green Party member who was on Air America talking about peace and environmentalism. Since then, she has evolved far to the right over a fairly short period of time. So just looking at what she has done as a member of the House and Senate, she has been one of the most friendly people to Trump, especially when it comes to major issues. Now, on a lot of minor issues, she'll vote with the Democrats. But when it comes to things where money is involved, the things that really matter, she has been on Trump's side. She voted to repeal the estate tax. She wants to weaken the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau by making it under the direction of a bipartisan commission rather than a director, meaning that Republicans will always have some measure of control over it, and they can, completely sideline its effectiveness. She wants to make the 2017 tax cuts permanent. She is strongly against the Green New Deal. She has been fairly vehement about that. She also voted to confirm oil man Bernhardt as the Secretary of the Interior, meaning handing over the preservation of America's natural parks to a guy who was all about drilling and fracking. So basically, from a left perspective, Kirsten Sinema is the literal worst case scenario. She is a younger, slightly gayer, more womanly version of Biden. Biden also has a horrific voting record when it comes to major issues, but at least most of his votes were pre-2008 for obvious reasons. Sinema's votes are all recent. And also, right now, when you're in an environment where most Democrats are adamantly anti-Trump, the fact that Sinema has been an out-and-out enabler of Trump's major policy initiatives is a major blow against her. That being said, because of the superficial things she has going for her, being young, attractive, etc., having the right amount of experience, the contrast, being the poster child for Gen X, she always, if you look at the way she dresses, she literally is a stereotypical Gen Xer, and to the extent that she's as stereotypically Gen X as Beto O'Rourke, and she looks like a missing cast member from Friends or Seinfeld. Anyhow, I think that she will appeal to Biden personally, Biden will look at her and see a kindred spirit. She is the Biden of Gen X. And because of that, Biden will advocate for her, I believe. Not only that, but if he's looking for someone who will be a successor to his vision and also be willing to fuck over workers consistently while paying lip service to a few socially liberal causes, then Kirsten Sinema is the person that the Democrats look to. There are going to be a few consultants who will still advocate for the traditional move to the right during the general, even though, as I said, there really is no room to the right because they already did that. Sinema is the only person who is clearly to Biden's right. So for the handful of consultants who will be proposing that, Sinema will be the person they will be pushing. So while she does not bring anything to a ticket that would be helpful, from the establishment perspective, the fact that she's young and bisexual would appeal to the left. They think that people on the left and young voters are stupid and that they will vote for someone who is young and somewhat gay. That was the thinking that drove the Pete Buttigieg campaign. They probably think that the only reason that he didn't get further was just bad luck. I doubt that too many of them are willing to admit that Pete Buttigieg was a terrible candidate and that he was creepy and off-putting. Also keep in mind that among Buttigieg's friends are people like Robbie Mook, who is still incredibly influential within the party and is still considered a political genius even after overseeing the 2016 election. This is the kind of person that Robbie Mook would like on a ticket. So do not discount the power of bad consultants who have the ears of major players. Sinema is very likely. However, there is one person who very much personifies the establishment ideal of the generic Democrat, someone who is the same as anyone else in theory, but is also generic enough that you could easily foist upon her whatever you want to see. Her name is Catherine Cortez Masto. Is, in my evaluation of how the establishment thinks, the most likely person to appear as Joe Biden's running mate. When I initially started doing research for this video, I did not think that she would be number one. Hell, I didn't even think that Kirsten Sinema would crack the top 10. But as I began to think more about how the establishment views the world, it became clear to me that they're really looking for someone who comes out of the blue, is a complete and total party loyalist, and just appears like your sort of stereotypical TV politician. No one fits the bill quite as well as Catherine Cortez Masto, who seems like a sort of randomly generated character in political machine. She's a Nevada senator. She has served since 2016, and before that she was a two-term Nevada Attorney General. Of course, she is Hispanic. She's 56 years old, so she is still on the sunny side of 60, which by the standards of politics makes her young, but not too young. And she's certainly old enough to govern. People will take her seriously without seeing her as being old or too young and inexperienced. So she's kind of in that prime range for being taken seriously as a presidential contender. She has a major ally in her corner, someone who, despite no longer being in office, is still incredibly influential and is pushing the Democrats repeatedly to do the Sun Belt strategy. That is former Senate leader Harry Reid. Harry Reid picked her as his successor, and he is still a major advocate of her. He wants her to be president, and he believes in her profoundly. His support goes a long way in those backroom meetings. She doesn't have very many firm stances, and the stances that she does have are extremely inoffensive. Those are the kind of stances you could expect out of anyone who calls himself a Democrat, and they're even so inoffensive that most Republicans would look at them and probably not think too much about them. She is pro-marijuana, which right now is very popular among both Democrats and independents, even some Republicans. And I think it's also a mainstream position at this point. It's pretty inoffensive. And it also is a nice contrast with Biden, so it creates a sort of contrast on a side issue, which doesn't threaten Biden, but does show that he's willing to work with someone who has a few different ideas. She has about the right amount of experience, maybe a little light, but not too much. And she meets all the identity criteria. She just kind of looks and feels right. She doesn't have the most upside, but at the same time, what are the downsides here? Who does she alienate? Not too many people. Who does she really excite or bring in? Well, not too many people, but Democrats have a tendency to play it safe when they have a lot of options and they don't really know what to do. If you look at 2004, part of the reason the party coalesced around John Kerry is because he seemed like the safest option. He was the closest thing they had to a generic Democrat, and that was the model they were working on at the time, even though I am befuddled at how someone who won the Medal of Honor and married a ketchup heiress could be considered generic, because that's a very specific and rather interesting life to lead. But nonetheless, let's not get into the idiocy of the 2004 election. Cortez Masto, I think, fits the bill of what the establishment is looking for the most. That being said, any of the top 4 people I talked about, I think, are very, very plausible as vice presidential picks. Let me know in the comments below who you think Biden will pick as his VP. Also, you may have noticed that the sound of this video is a little different than what has come before. I've gotten a new mic. It's a Samsung, and I'm still adjusting it and perfecting it, but this is the G-Track Pro, which is supposedly the best USB mic you can buy. So thank you to my Patreon supporters. Without your support, I would not have this. I'm trying to get a pop filter for it. It should arrive soon. But let me know if you can tell a difference in the audio quality. At this point, you've heard a very long sample of my voice, so you should have a good idea of how well or poorly this mic fares. Anyway, until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and we'll talk about the future of the left.